at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Your president. Today we'll hear from Medea Benjamin, who will provide her perspective on the labor practices of international corporations. And we'll talk about her attempts to increase the wages and improve the working condition of third world workers. Next Friday, September 25th, the club will sponsor the first of its 5 political candidate debates. Next week we'll have a debate between the candidates for the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Margaret Carter and Stan Bunn. We will also present and vote on one of the first 4 ballot measure studies that club volunteers have worked on this fall. In subsequent weeks we'll hear debates between candidates for City Commissioner, 1st Congressional District, Governor, and the U.S. Senate. So you'll want to be here for that. Our board host today is Jay Formick. Jay, as you know, is chair of our research board. He'll ask the first question of the speaker, and then we'll take questions from City Club members in the audience. Our program today is made possible due to the corporate underwriting of Lane Powell, Spears Libersky, Weyerhaeuser Corporation, and CH2M Hill. We're certainly grateful for their continuing support. Medea Benjamin is co-founder and co-director of Global Exchange, a San Francisco-based organization that monitors the labor practices of international corporations which contract with workers in countries having cheap labor, few labor laws, and governments that outlaw labor unions. We hear a lot these days about labor conditions overseas. Kathy Lee Gifford gets put on the hot seat for manufacturing her clothing line in overseas sweatshops. Phil Knight indignantly proclaims that Nike improves the working condition of workers throughout Asia. Now, one of the reasons we hear so much about this issue is through the efforts of Medea Benjamin and Global Exchange. She started writing and speaking about third world working conditions really before any of us were aware of what was going on. Now, prior to that, she worked for 10 years as an economist and nutritionist in Latin America, Africa, and Europe. She has worked for the United Nations and the World Health Organization and has written books on working conditions in Brazil, Central America, and Cuba. Her articles have appeared in the Los Angeles Times, the International Herald Tribune, the San Francisco Chronicle, as well as many other internationally published magazines and newspapers. Now, for those of you looking for something to do in your spare time, you might consider her book on the Peace Corps and more, 175 ways to get involved in development efforts and human rights activism overseas. But I suspect there's something we can do short of joining the Peace Corps to effect change in the third world. Perhaps you'll tell us. Let's welcome Medea Benjamin.
On this microphone. Hi, I want to thank you for inviting me here today. I don't have a corporate sponsor to thank, but I do want to thank the local Justice Do It Nike, which is a group that has been trying to get these issues out locally for many years, in fact, before I got involved. And I know that Nike was invited to be part of this and be up here with me and give their points of view, and I was disappointed that they didn't take the opportunity to do so. So if there is a Nike representative here, I hope during the question time at least we can hear some of your opinions. So the topic of the discussion is workers' rights and corporate wrongs, and unfortunately in today's global economy there are many corporations that I could choose to speak about. There are many industries I could choose to speak about. We could talk about the mining industry and the destruction of indigenous communities in those places where the mines are located. We could talk about the oil industry. We could talk about where we get our food from, the bananas that you might have had in your cereal this morning, and what the conditions are for the workers who are picking those bananas. There are lots of workers' rights issues around the world to discuss. I wanted to focus on one industry, which is the garment and shoe industry. And I don't want to be accused of picking on one company, because Nike has said to us, why do you always pick on us? And it's kind of funny thinking of picking on a $9 billion company. But I did want to use Nike because we're here in Portland, and it is a good illustration of what has happened in the global economy. Because as you probably know, Philip Knight, the CEO of Nike, was really on the forefront or in the vanguard of picking up and moving overseas and looking overseas for sources of cheap labor. And in the garment and shoe industry, it meant the loss of many thousands of jobs, not hundreds of thousands of jobs, in the course of the last 3 decades. And the important thing to think about when you think of companies closing down factories in the United States to move overseas, it's not just a question of trying to find cheap labor, to take advantage of the fact that there are different living standards in other countries, and if you can make a pair of shoes paying somebody 20 cents an hour, why pay them $9 an hour? There's there's a lot of rationale behind that. What makes it worse in my mind is the fact that companies look for repressed labor, because repressed labor actually means cheap labor that is artificially low wages. And in that, Nike, unfortunately, was really on the forefront. I wanted to read to you a piece that Nike itself was sending out in some packets that it sent to students on colleges when they started protesting some of the Nike labor practices. They would get this very nice booklet. And in it was an interesting article that came from a company called Jardine Fleming International Securities Limited. And if you actually started reading the article, there was a subheading called Nike Likes a Strong Government. And the paragraph in there that I found most interesting, it says, if we delve into where Nike has produced sneakers and its comments about political stability, we notice that Nike tends to favor strong governments. For example, Nike was a major producer in both Korea and Taiwan when these countries were largely under military rule. It currently favors China, where the communists and only 2 men have led the country since 1949, and in Indonesia, where President Suharto, well, this was written a year ago while he was still in power, where President Suharto has been in charge since 1967. The Communist Party is still very much alive in Vietnam, which is the new country that Nike has gone into. Nike never did move into the Philippines in a big way in the 80s when democracy there flourished. Thailand's democracy movement of 1992 also corresponded to Nike's downgrading of production in that country. So you have today the fact that Nike produces the vast majority of its shoes in 2 countries, China and Indonesia. Indonesia, a country before the fall of Suharto that was ruled by a dictatorship for over 30 years. China, a country where independent trade unions are not allowed. And then the third most important producer country for Nike right now in terms of shoes is Vietnam, where workers also don't have the right to form independent trade unions. So what happens when you combine the cheap labor with repressive governments, governments where workers cannot organize into unions that stand up for their own interests, is it's a formula for abuse. And those kind of abuses have been hitting the TV screens and on television, on radio, in the newspapers for the last 2 years, and Nike is really taking a beating over this issue. You've probably all seen some of these reports that have come out, starting talking about things like child labor, forced overtime in the factories, use of toxic chemicals that were making workers sick, the military coming in to put down strikes in Indonesia, for example, physical abuse of workers, workers being hit over the head with shoes, verbal abuse of workers, the kind of things that did not give Nike a very good reputation. one of the other issues that was coming out loud and clear was the issue of wages. One thing is when countries around the world are vying for foreign investment and they all start lowering the standards and lowering the standards precisely to attract U.S. companies. So you have China saying, come and work here and we'll give you workers for 30 cents an hour. And then you have Vietnam saying, no, come here, we'll do it for 25 cents an hour. And now you have the economic crisis in Indonesia where workers are now working for under 10 cents an hour. And during the time when we first started this campaign as Global Exchange, and this was just only about 2 years ago, Nike was saying, we are paying good wages. In fact, we are paying twice the minimum wage, somewhat acknowledging that the minimum wage is not enough to fulfill workers' needs, and Nike insisting they were paying twice the minimum wage. And lo and behold, we went to Asia, we talked to workers, we looked at pay stubs, and we discovered that Nike was not paying twice the minimum wage. In fact, Nike wasn't even paying the minimum wage. It wasn't even abiding by the local labor laws. And in fact, we discovered documents that year after year in the 1990s in Indonesia, the shoe contractors, because you have to understand that Nike and the other shoe companies don't own their own factories, they contract out to contracting factories. And these factories every year had gone to the government and said, it would be a hardship for us to give workers the minimum wage, and so we want an exemption from that. And we were just dumbfounded to find that, not just Nike, but Reebok and Adidas and Fila and these, extremely wealthy companies, their subcontractors were paying workers below the minimum wage, and we're using all kinds of tricks to cheat workers out of their wages, like using an apprentice wage, that it took you 3 months to figure out how to stand on a factory line and rub a little glue on a shoe. So you'd get an apprentice wage for 3 months and then start earning the minimum wage after that. So we started making an outcry about this issue, and that is one issue that has changed. In fact, Nike now says to its subcontractors, don't you dare ask for an exemption, except the contractors still do it. In fact, it happened this year, just recently in Vietnam, and Nike stepped in again and said, this would be scandalous, this would make us look terrible, you've got to pay at least the minimum wage. But the important thing is that Nike was not paying the workers a decent wage and was lying to us as consumers by insisting that they were paying twice the minimum wage when they weren't doing that. Now, I said that when we started looking into this issue, the first thing we did was to go to Asia to try to get into the factories, which Nike never let us do, but to talk to workers. And another thing that astounded me was, I don't know if any of you here saw the movie that Michael Moore did called The Big One. Yes, a couple of you are shaking your heads, yes. Well, there was, Philip Knight agreed to an interview in that movie, and one of the most astounding things that came out was the fact that here is a country, Indonesia, where Nike had been producing its shoes for 8 years. It was the largest producer for Nike, and Philip Knight had never been to Indonesia. I mean, isn't that quite amazing to you? That he was, at that point, worth $5 billion, has over 100,000 workers in the country of Indonesia, and had never been to the country, had never visited a factory, and had never sat down to have a chat with a worker. So we did. We went to Indonesia, we went over to Hong Kong, we went to Vietnam, and we talked to workers. And what we found out is not only were the conditions in the factory bad for workers, but probably the saddest thing for me is to see how the workers were living. Because when you went to see workers who at that time were working incredible numbers of hours a day, now production is down and so they're not working as many hours, but that at that time they were working 10 and 12 hours a day in a factory where you are working constantly the entire time, there are no breaks. Oftentimes 6 days a week. When there was a lot of production, they were working 7 days a week. And we go home with them to the living quarters and see the kind of conditions they lived in. And you would see 6 or 7 women living together in one room, having to spread out a little mat on the floor to be sleeping like sardines next to each other. Having no amenities in the house, no running water, no bathroom was in their house. And we thought, this is how somebody lives after working like a dog day in and day out for a very rich company. And we went to another part of town and visited with workers who were also assembly line factory workers who were working for other U.S. companies like Gillette, like Goodyear, and found that they were living relative to the living standards in that country, middle-class lives. They were living in concrete houses, they had bedrooms, they had fans, they had motorcycles. Their children were getting an education. In fact, I remember one worker who had worked for Goodyear for about 20 years proudly saying that his son was going to college and how exciting it was for their family. It was the first time in the family's history that anybody had made it to college. And you felt proud. You felt, you know, I'm proud to be an American whose companies are coming here and helping to lift people out of poverty. And that's what we wanted Nike to do. That's what we want the shoe industry to do. That's what we want the garment industry to do, to provide good jobs for workers. So they're not just, you know, sucked in for all their juices when they're young women, because they're mostly young women, and then thrown out when they can't keep up the pace anymore. But these are jobs that they could stay at, that they could make a life's work out of these jobs, and they could really pull themselves out of poverty. And after listening to the workers, after hearing their stories, after seeing how they lived, we thought, well, it's important for U.S. consumers to hear these stories. And so one of the things we did, and we did it actually with a lot of help from the local Justice Do It Nike group, was to bring a Nike worker to the United States. And the first time we brought her here, her name was Chichi Sukaisi. And I just wanted to tell you two stories that happened while we were in Portland, because they were really some of the high moments of the trip for me and bring out some very important issues. One was that we had been asking prior to the trip for a meeting with Philip Knight. And this is a worker who had been fired from one of the factories in Indonesia because she had been fighting to push the factory to pay the minimum wage when it wasn't paying the minimum wage. At that time, this was back in 1992, the minimum wage was $1.20 an hour, and a day, excuse me, and they were earning $1.10 a day. So they were fighting over 10 cents. And fighting in Indonesia at that time meant really the military coming in, putting yourself at risk, putting your life at risk. And this was a very brave woman that, with 24 of her colleagues, had been accused of being the troublemakers, had been kicked out of their jobs, and we brought her to the United States to talk to consumers and to talk to Nike. Well, Philip Knight refused to have a meeting with her, and then we said, well, then can we speak to anybody at Nike? You have a lot of people that you're employing there. Can't we come and let her tell her story to anybody? And they said, no, nobody has time for you here. So she was also carrying some petitions that U.S. groups had given her, calling on Nike to improve the working conditions. And we said, well, let's just go over to the berm and hand in these petitions and see if we get there, would anybody meet with us. So we went over to Nike headquarters, and this was myself, Chi-Chi, who's about my height, and we're both, if 5 feet would be a little exaggeration. And there was a third woman who was a translator, who was also another tiny woman. So 3 of us, very little women, walking up that long campusway. And those of you who have been to the Nike headquarters, it's a very imposing long campusway, because they wouldn't let us bring the car in at that point. So the 3 of us were walking in, and they had heard we were coming, and they lined up security guards all along the way. And there were these like big Samoan security guards, and they all had their walkie-talkies. And as we'd go, you know, every couple of feet, they would say, okay, they're 100 feet closer. All right, they're coming towards the building. They're now 50 feet away. They're now, and you know, it was just this crazy scenario of these 3 little women wanting to hand in some petitions and talk to anybody at Nike so she could tell her story, and yet we were treated like we were these criminals. And it was a very hot day, and I remember we were sort of sweating as we were walking along that lane up to the headquarters. And when we got inside, there was a nice, refreshing-looking pitcher of water with little lemon slices in it and some glasses out there. And so I walked over to pour a glass of water to give it to our guest from Indonesia who makes these Nike shoes, and the guards grabbed the pitcher from me and said, I'm sorry, that's private property. So that was the greeting, and then when we asked to speak to anybody, they said, nobody can speak to you, you must leave. And we said, well, we'd like to just wait here until somebody comes and talk to us. And so they said, all right, we'll have to call the police, which they did. So in addition to all these security guards we were surrounded by, they called in the police, and they physically ejected these 3 small women off of the campus. Instead of just sitting down and listening and talking to us. But while we were surrounded by the Samoan guards and the policemen, I was thinking, oh no, what did we get this poor Indonesian worker into? Here we brought her to another country, she doesn't know what's going on, she's surrounded by all these huge policemen. And so through the interpreter I said, you know, I'm really sorry we put you in this situation, and I hope you're not really frightened. And she answered back, since I've been in the United States, and she had been there about 2 weeks so far, this is the only time I feel right at home. She knew what confronting the military was all about. And the other moment during that visit to Portland that will stick in my mind for many, many years to come was when we visited Nike Town, where the Nike shoes are on such exuberant display. And we were outside, and there were some demonstrators outside, and so Chi-Chi was addressing some of the demonstrators. And then we said, why don't we go inside? And she said, go inside? Like, you know, how can a worker go inside a store that's selling these shoes? And we said, sure, you know, come on inside. We go inside, and she looks at the shoes, and she's getting really excited, looking in the tongues of them to see, you know, which ones were made in Indonesia, which ones she recognized as shoes that she had made. And then we said to her, Chi-Chi, have you ever tried on a pair of shoes? And she said, I make 300 of these shoes every day for years, and I have never, ever put a pair on my feet. And so we had her sit down, and we brought over a pair of the shoes, and she put on a pair of shoes. And to me, it was the saddest moment of the visit, because she got up, and there was a mirror, you know, where you look at yourself in the shoes, and she got out, and she put on the shoes, and she kind of bounced around, and she looked in the mirror sideways, and she looked the other way and bounced around, and she said, these are really good shoes. She said, we do really good work, because she had never had on a shoe that had a lot of bounce to it like that. And then the next thing she said is, too bad neither I nor any of my co-workers could ever afford to buy a pair of these shoes. And it would have cost 3 months of her salary to buy a pair of those shoes. And you think, you know, what has this global economy come to? Remember Henry Ford, and remember the ideas that, you know, you would pay the workers who are making the cars enough money so they could buy a car? Well, here Nike has 500,000 workers in Asia that are producing these shoes, and not one of those 500,000 workers could afford to buy a pair of shoes. And now part of the crisis that Nike is going through is overproduction. Well, you have overproduction because not enough people have enough money to buy those shoes. So you would think there would be some logic where you would consider paying workers enough so they could buy the products that you're making. And we're not talking about making Boeing jet airplanes like in China. We're talking about a pair of shoes. And I just wanted to read something that somebody sent to me just yesterday, who is a friend of mine whose daughter goes to a Catholic school. And in her book this year, they use a book called Sharing God's Goodness, and the book is called Christian Justice. And lo and behold, on page 143, there is a discussion of the global economy, and it looks at Nike. And one of the paragraphs talks about another Nike worker whose name is Sadisa. And it shows a pay stub of how much Sadisa earns. It says, here are Sadisa's net earnings for a month of labor. She put in 6 days each week, 10.5 hours a day for a paycheck the equivalent of $37, about the half of a retail price of one pair of mid-priced Nike shoes that she makes. Boosters of the global economy claim that creating such employment around the world promotes free trade. But how many Western products can people in Indonesia buy when they can't earn enough to eat? The answer can't be found in Nike's TV ads showing Michael Jordan sailing above the earth for a $20 million endorsement fee, an amount, incidentally, that would take Sadisa 44,492 years to earn. So, talk about Christian justice. Where do we go with this issue? I think we have made some tremendous gains just in the last couple of years. To broaden out and not just to talk about Nike, but about the shoe and garment industry in general, and as Peter mentioned in the introduction, talking about Kathy Lee Gifford and her crying on television when they said her products of her clothing line were being made by child labor. I think a number of things have happened. The most important thing is that in the early 90s, companies were still saying, we are just the buyers. We don't own the factories. We buy the products. We don't know how they're being made. We're not responsible. We are just the buyers. You don't hear any company talking like that anymore, and that's very important. Now they're saying, yes, we do have a responsibility, and in fact, they've outlined that responsibility in codes of conduct. And these codes of conduct, just about every major company now has a code of conduct. And most of them say things like, we will not buy from companies that are using child labor. We will ensure that the factories have good health and safety conditions for the workers. It talks about not using prison labor, not using bonded labor. Many of these codes actually talk about freedom of association, that workers should have the right to organize into associations of their choosing. Some of them even talk about workers having the right to collective bargaining. So there are a number of good codes that the companies now have. Now that too is important because it's a statement in writing that the company says, we take this responsibility. The point we're at now is, how are those codes going to be monitored? How can we believe what's on those codes? And this became very clear when Nike in May 15th, Philip Knight at the National Press Club in Washington announced new labor initiatives that said that we were going to make some significant changes in the company. We're going to raise the age at which workers can work in the factories. We are going to have U.S. air quality standards be applied to our factories overseas. We're going to allow independent monitors to go into the factory and verify this. Well, that hasn't been done yet. That's the stage that we're at now with Nike and other companies. Other companies are experimenting with this, and this is an experiment of letting labor groups, letting human rights groups into the factories to see that conditions are decent for the workers. The Gap has one experiment that they tried in El Salvador in a factory. Levi's, just after years of saying they didn't need any outside monitoring, that things were fine in their factories, allowed a group in the Dominican Republic to work with them in a couple of factories and had a very good experience, and I think overcame a lot of their fears of working with some of these labor rights and human rights organizations. We in this Nike working group are in discussions with Reebok now about doing some independent monitoring in factories in Vietnam and Indonesia. And we have been in regular discussions now with Nike trying to get them to agree to allow one experiment in one factory in Vietnam. And to Nike's credit, they have been talking to us on a regular basis, have been having these ongoing discussions, but there is still a great deal of fear on the part of Nike for working with the critics, and we can understand that. But we're saying, you know, it's time that we work together, that we're not into bashing Nike to bash Nike. We're into getting Nike to recognize that these are not PR problems, these are serious problems that affect people's lives in the factories, and let's work together to improve those lives. Nike says its goals are to improve conditions in the factory, that the critics have actually made it into a better company now because it has had to make some major changes in those factories. So what we're saying now is, let's forget the bashing of each other. You know, Philip Knight once said that Global Exchange was this radical fringe organization that was in bed with Fidel Castro in Cuba and supported armed guerrillas in Mexico, and I don't know what else he was saying about us. You know, we're not some crazy fringe group. We are a human rights organization that wants companies to respect workers' rights. And Nike is saying it wants to improve the conditions for workers in the workplace, so we have the same goals. So let's work together. If conditions are indeed improving in the factories, which we think they are, let us inside. Let us verify, show off. Show all that you have done in the last couple of years to improve things. So that's one of the main messages that we have to Nike and to companies in general, is work with us. And the last thing I wanted to say is, while we as consumer groups and labor rights groups and all the kinds of organizations, human rights organizations that have gotten involved in this process, have been selecting a company here, you know, the Gap over here, and maybe Levi's over here, and Nike over here. It's an ad hoc kind of thing. And it's pressuring a company to make changes, and we think that these changes will move the whole industry, but at some point we've got to find ways to really move towards regulations. That it's not just Nike decides to do the right thing and so has good air quality standards in its factories. It's got to be that there are regulations, and we have a global economy, we need global regulations. And the way we see this moving is that first there would be these voluntary changes on the part of individual companies. Then we would move towards US government regulations. And there are government regulations in place now that say we can't import things that are made with prison labor or bonded labor. Very recently there was an amendment that added to that we can't import things made with child labor. Why don't we have regulations that say US companies have to abide by the same environmental and labor standards overseas as we have in the United States? Well, then US companies say we would be at an unfair advantage vis-a-vis the companies in Europe or companies in Japan or the South Koreans that have a lot of factories overseas. That's true. That's why we need international regulations. And there is an international organization called the International Labor Organization, part of the United Nations. It's been around for a long, long time. It has international labor standards that have been established decades ago. So what we see happening and are pushing towards, and we're not saying this is going to happen next year or the year after, we're looking at a longer timetable, but that we have to have the International Labor Organization setting the standards that are global standards that will stop this horrible race to the bottom of what country can provide the cheapest workers in the most repressed conditions, but start bringing those standards up. And so we see this as part of a really historic movement that everyone here, you all wear clothes, I see that. You're all consumers. We all have a responsibility in this. And it's an exciting movement, it's a historic movement to get companies to take that responsibility, to get our government to take that responsibility, and then get some kind of international regulations through the United Nations so that workers are working in good conditions and that we as consumers don't have to feel guilty when we're buying a pair of shoes, or we don't have to feel uncomfortable that we don't know in what conditions the clothes that we put on our bodies are made. So that's what we're working towards, and I hope you find that this is not an anti-business kind of a sentiment, but it's a pro-justice, pro-fairness, a very moral kind of stand, and that you will work with us to convince those in the business community that this, in the long run, is in the interest of all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Medea Benjamin. That was a very interesting address, and I'm going to start right off by asking you a challenging question. In your opening comments, you seem to be suggesting that repression of labor is a criterion for selecting manufacturers overseas. And somehow or another, I envisioned in my mind a bunch of guys sitting around the corporate conference room going down a checklist. Let me see, they do quality production, they have adequate electricity, they have good labor repression, and good transportation system. Let's go with them. Somehow, I don't think that that figures on anyone's list for selecting a manufacturer. I want to challenge you to describe what you meant by that. Is this a corporate strategy? And do you have evidence to support what I thought I heard you saying, that this is a criterion for selecting a manufacturer?
Well, I unfortunately haven't been privy to those discussions when they sit around looking at what are the criteria. What I see is the results. And the results are pretty obvious. I could certainly see people sitting around and having a discussion about how labor unions are a pain in the butt. That they just, in fact, I just came back from Honduras 2 weeks ago. I met with a representative of the what's called the Maquila Association, which are the factories that produce the garments that are sent back into the United States. And I also met with a representative of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And I said to them, could you describe a little bit of the conditions in the factories? And they were saying that these are privileged jobs. And we asked, are they allowed to form unions in these jobs? And the woman from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce said, there's no reason for them to form unions because I just said these are privileged jobs. And why would they need to have any kinds of unions? Now, this is a country in Honduras where legally on the books you are allowed to have unions, but you talk to workers and anytime they try to organize in the factory, they are thrown out of their jobs, and the government Ministry of Labor does not come back to defend them and get them reinstituted. And so I think if you look at where companies have preferred to work, the #1 country where they prefer to work is China. China, there's no possibility for forming independent labor unions, and there's tremendous collusion between the governments, the heads of the factory, and the government-run trade union. If you look at the other places that the companies work, they would be areas along the border of Mexico, for example, or free trade zones in countries in the Caribbean and in Central America. And in all of those places, workers either don't have the rights to organize or de facto they are not allowed to organize. So I think certainly that businesses, companies have had a very anti-union stand and prefer countries or free trade zones in countries where workers are not going to get together and get rowdy and start making demands like pay us a living wage.
Andrew Kaiser, City Club member. My inference from your statements is that on the long term your desire is to improve the quality of life, quality of living for people who live in the third world, generically speaking. It's my observation that about 24 democracies representing about 1/8 of the world's population consume about 3/4 of the world's resources. And the observation that we're experiencing declining fish runs and worldwide deforestation, at least the consumption of lumber beyond the level to replace it, the only real economic model that I can see is a decline of the quality of life in the first world at the benefit of the third world, fairly substantially so. Is that what you're advocating for the long-term desire of public policy?
Well, I don't think I'd get many followers if I went around and said I advocated deterioration in the quality of life for the first world. I think what we're advocating is that, you know, sometimes people say, well, you know, this is the way people in those countries live. You know, we're not setting those standards. Those are standards that are there. We're trying to say that workers everywhere, people everywhere throughout the world, would like to live in decent conditions. They would like to have clean water to drink. You know, once I was talking to a woman about conditions in the third world, and she held up the glass of water that she was drinking at that time, and she said, in my country, this is a miracle. You know, clean water to drink. I think there are some basic things that everybody in the world should have, deserves to have. We are certainly over-consuming in the first world. And there is certainly lack of very, very basic things, health care, decent education, clean drinking water, that every human being in this world deserves. I am not saying that it is the responsibility of Nike to lift every person out of poverty, but I do think that when we look at the global economy and we say, you know, what are we advocating? We're advocating that meaning our U.S. companies, when they go overseas, are doing something beneficial that's helping people to move up in the standard and quality of life, not taking advantage of the poor quality of life they already have.
Hi, Bill Parrish, City Club member, and like yourself, former Peace Corps volunteer. But interestingly now, I'm an investment advisor, and a real common question people ask nowadays is how they can socially responsibly invest. And my question to you would be to maybe provide a response to this statement. As you know, in a lot of countries in Latin America, there's no infrastructure. For instance, in Peru, there are no phones. People can't get around. And what I often tell people is that the two best investments they can make are in telecommunications and infrastructure. And great examples are Sprint and Intel. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that there are a number of screens that people can use when they're looking into investment. And I'm not here to advocate that people invest in Intel or any telecommunication company. I think people should invest with a conscience. And there are even very mainstream investment firms now that have screens for socially responsible investment. It's a very fuzzy word, it's a very fuzzy term, it's very imprecise. But you can look at the things that are most important to you and try to put a screen on. You can say, I will not invest in tobacco companies. I will not invest in companies that produce military goods. I will invest in companies that have shown that they give equal opportunities to people of different races and don't just discriminate on the basis of gender. I mean, there are many ways that you can look at these issues, and I think everyone has different criteria that are important to them. But I do think the point is a well-taken point that people who do invest, and more people, at least before the present beginnings of the fall in the stock market, are invested in the stock market, we should do so thinking about what companies we're investing in.
Joella Werlin, club member. I'm also a member of Global Exchange and went to the World Women's Conference in China with the Global Exchange group, and don't consider myself a radical. Medea, how can we be more responsible consumers? I mean, if you're looking at how your dollar is being spent in the world, what is it that we can do at the consumer level that represents the most responsible kind of action?
Well, one of the hardest things in this whole fight against sweatshops has been not having a good answer for the most commonly asked question is, what should I buy and what shouldn't I buy? And there have been a lot of discussions and people involved in this movement around the issue of boycotts, for example. We at Global Exchange have never advocated a boycott of a company because we don't think boycotts often end up in workers losing their jobs, and that's not what we're after either. So we have not, there are a number of small companies, and we often encourage people to look at locally produced goods. I'm sure here in Portland there's a lot of smaller companies that produce just about everything your heart could desire. There's a catalog that a group called Co-op America puts out that has a lot of good companies that take a lot of care around environmental issues and workers' rights issues. They tend not to be the big brand name companies. And so it's very hard for us to say, you know, don't buy Nikes, buy Reebok. Well, we can't say that because basically they're all more or less working in the same fashion. There is a company, New Balance, that is trying to produce more of its shoes in the United States, but still a lot of its production is coming from China. And in terms of clothing, we're working very closely with Levi's because we think they're a company that has traditionally put a lot of care into these issues. Unfortunately, they too have closed down most of their factories in the United States. Many of their factories were union factories and moved them overseas. And they just recently announced they were going back into China, which at one point in 1993 they said they were pulling out of China because they could not guarantee the conditions in those factories. Now they're going back in, and we're in discussions with them saying, okay, if you're going back in, set some higher standards when you go back in. And we wrote out a series of 6 points that we thought could make a difference. That if they went back into China, that they disclosed what factories they were working with, that they allowed independent monitoring of those factories, and that they work with the human rights community in general to improve the human rights situation in China. And we were quite surprised that a company like Levi's, that does have a reputation for social responsibility, really balked at the idea that they would be somehow involved around human rights issues in general in China. And we said to them, well, we brought in a businessman from that works in China, and he gives companies a list of political prisoners in the provinces that that company is working with, and said, you don't have to be heavy-handed about this. When you're having a dinner or a meeting with some official from the government that you're working with, just hand over the list and say, I'd just like to inquire about the names on this list. And he said, you'd be amazed at the difference that makes. In fact, he had a list of 400 prisoners and how many of them had been inquired about and the difference that made in getting them out of prison. And he came with us and he said to Levi's, this will not jeopardize your doing business at all. I can guarantee you that. But it will make a difference in the lives of people who have been put in jail for nothing but their thoughts. And Levi said, we want to make pants in a socially responsible way. We are not a human rights organization. We would not do that. And so we have continued the discussion. We're getting some of our Congress people involved to meet with Levi's, and said, yes, this is precisely the kind of thing that you have to be involved in, that corporations have a responsibility to human rights. You are working in China, you are making money there, you are making money off the fact that workers are being repressed and don't have the right to stand up for themselves. You have to get involved in these larger issues. But I found it very disappointing that a company as, quote, socially responsible as Levi's, we still have to fight with them around this issue. So unfortunately, in the big names, we are yet to be able to comfortably say to you, buy this one.
Ruth Curry, a member. Recently, in July, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom held a Congress just outside of Baltimore. And one of the top issues that was discussed there was globalization. I'm wondering what your experience has been with other countries. I mean, are they doing the same thing as U.S. countries, or are they as concerned, the companies from other countries, of the first and second world?
Well, we are certainly in a global economy. We have very close relationships with groups all over Europe. We have just made closer relationships with groups in Japan, groups in South Korea, whose companies are often the subcontractors that are producing for companies like Nike. There are movements all over the world involved in these issues now. Nike has said to us, why don't you pick on Adidas? And then we go to our friends in Germany and say, pick on Adidas. You have to go to the home country where the companies are based. And there is, in this area of the garments, there's a European-wide group called the Clean Clothes Campaign, and in every single country in Europe, there is an organization that is part of that. We work very closely with them because we understand, as I was saying towards the end of my talk, that one company can't do this alone and one country can't do it alone. That it has to be something that we're at least pushing the companies all over the world in order to get to that point where we have some kind of international regulations.
Hi, Bill Tritt, City Club member. I have 3 quick questions. Number 1 is the $1.10 a day that you talked about, what that equates to their living conditions. Number 2 is, if these people were not working in the Nike factories, what would they be doing? And number 3, the level of education as far as the people that you made a comparison to as far as Gillette. Could the Nike employees work in the Gillette factory?
Well, I'll start with the last one. In terms of the Gillette factory, the people that we met with were unskilled labor. They said they came in with absolutely no skills. They were taught on the job, put on the assembly line, and they felt that they had exactly the same level of education and the same level of skills as people who would work in a Nike factory, let's say. You asked about the $1.10 a day and what that would translate to in terms of living conditions. That's sort of what I was saying when we went to Indonesia and we saw the way that people were living, and it's not just in Indonesia. I said that I came back just a week ago from Central America looking into the garment industry, and it's not just appalling, it's so sad when you see what these wages translate to in terms of what you can buy. My most recent experience of just a week ago, in the northern part of Honduras, workers were making $3.50 a day. You drive around in San Pedro Sula, which is the town I was in, and you see U.S. fast food shops everywhere. You see the McDonald's and the Burger King and the Taco Bell and the Denny's and the Kentucky Fried Chicken. They're ubiquitous. So we went in and we took a worker inside with us. She had never had a hamburger in her life because a Big Mac, fries, and a Coke would cost exactly her daily wage, $3.50. The prices of the foods in the stores were high. They were almost equivalent to prices in the United States. The rents, a small room for them to rent, would cost a third of their salary, and this is just a one-room hovel where a couple of them would have to get together to share that space. So the living conditions are terrible. And that's why we're saying we can't talk about minimum wages, we have to talk about a living wage. And Philip Knight at times has tried to distort what we are asking for and say, you know, Global Exchange wants Nike to pay U.S. wages in Indonesia. And we have never said that. In fact, right now what we are asking for is them to double the wages. They're making 80 cents a day right now, double it to $1.60 a day. In our calculations, that would be for over about 100,000 workers in Indonesia. That would cost Nike about $20 million. Nike, that would be a tenth of what Nike paid to the Brazilian soccer team. It would be the equivalent of a couple of ads for Nike. And imagine all the free press that Nike would get out of that. So we think, you know, doubling the wages would actually be allowing workers to live a decent standard of living and good press for the company. And then you had the middle question.
Where would they be doing?
Oh, what would they be doing? Yeah, that's a very important question because a lot of the companies say, you know, they would be eking out a living in the countryside. Yes, they would be eking out a living in the countryside. And the question, this brings up, you know, a larger question about models of development and maybe goes back to something that a previous question had brought up about standards of living and consumption in one country versus overconsumption in another. In one sense, when you look at the models that have come out of companies coming into the cities, workers teeming out of the rural areas into the cities, you get the urban slums. You get a lot of delinquency because you have the mothers in the factories all day long and the kids out by themselves. You have a very ugly situation that's building up in Jakarta, in Bangkok, in Mexico City, in San Pedro Sula, where I came from. It was horrible. It was a really horrible city. And everybody would tell you, don't go out at night. After 8 o'clock at night, don't go out. There is so much delinquency. And they would tell you that it came from the women spending their days in the factories, no child care provided for the kids, and the kids at home alone, and them starting to build up gangs and that kind of thing. Now again, I don't want to sound like, you know, one company is responsible for this, but it's a model that's not a very good model for individuals and not a very good model in the long term for our planet. I don't know what we're going to do about that. But I would think that in many ways, it would be better for people, more people to stay in the countryside, to make a living from the land, than to get into the situation in the city, because it's not even so much what were they doing before their jobs, what do they do after they lose these jobs? Because you can't do these jobs for more than about 4 or 5 years. You get totally wasted. The production quotas are so high and you have to work so fast and workers get sick. And then what do you do after that? Then you're stuck. You know, you're stuck in the city, you can't go home after that. And so it really, in the long run, is not a good thing for workers.
Dan Goldie, member. At the present time, you're speaking at a time when in Asia we have raging deflation, economic deflation, which appears to be spreading not only to Eastern Europe, but now to Latin America. The President on Monday addressed the Council on Foreign Relations, outlined a plan, a program to stimulate, get the cooperation of other countries to stimulate economic growth so these countries could come out of this depression, deep depression they're in. Among the things he called for was the Congress, the House of Representatives, to quit holding hostage to an anti-family planning amendment the money for the International Monetary Fund crucial to helping Latin America. Now, you indicated that you called on industry to take the larger view. My question is global exchange interested in these larger issues that so severely affect the question of the position of workers in these countries, and are you people taking a position on these national issues like the IMF?
Yes. We have been very involved around issues like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Our position is that we want monies that are going into countries to shore up failing economies not to go into shoring up bad investments that people had made. We think investment is supposed to imply some risks to it, and if you took a bad risk, you made a bad investment, then you lost your money, and that's too bad. But we do think that we should be helping people when there is a crisis and people's lives are affected by it. And so we would like to see, if IMF money is going to any country, that there be conditions on it that are democratic conditionality. Is there a democratic government in place that would give a chance for that money to be spread around in a way that would reach the poor? Are there certain criteria in place, for example, that the country allows workers to organize into independent unions? We think that we should not be throwing money into dictatorships like we did for a long time in Indonesia. And that if we're going to give money to other countries, we put some conditions on them that would be positive things for workers, not for investment bankers. Sorry to those of you who are investment bankers.
I'm Ray Polani, a City Club member. There obviously is a relationship between purchasing power and standard of living. My question is, how will global competition affect the U.S. Workers and the U.S. market and economy?
Well, that's a really important question. I think if there's one thing I failed to talk about and maybe give somewhat of a misrepresentation here is that we have these great standards in the United States and that we should go and impose our standards overseas. Because in fact, the garment industry is a great example of how the race to the bottom has affected us here at home. We had almost sort of virtually eliminated the scourge of sweatshops in the United States over struggles that started in the last century. And the sweatshops came back with a vengeance as a result of this global economy. And when you can get this cheap labor overseas, and every time that workers get together and say, you know, we want better standards here at home, they say, oh, well, that's nice, we're taking off, we're moving overseas, which is happening, continues to happen every day. You can't improve the standards in the United States, and in fact, the standards have gotten worse. And we even had, under the Reagan administration, the gutting of the inspectors who went out to inspect workplaces in the United States. And so our last Secretary of Labor, Robert Reich, got up and said that half of the garment producing places in the United States were sweatshops, meaning they had serious violation of U.S. laws, and traced it to this global economy that was pitting worker against workers, and making it harder for workers in the United States to stand up for their rights. And there are many places in the United States where immigrant workers, oftentimes illegal immigrant workers, are not even getting minimum wage in the United States, and we all probably know that minimum wage here is not a living wage. So yes, it's come to haunt us back at home. And I think that's why we should see the issue is not only helping to improve the lives of workers overseas, but I think it will start putting a floor that will help to improve lives of people who are working at the bottom level here in the United States.
Let's have one last short question.
Okay, Carol Witherell, City Club member. Thank you for your presentation. How far are we from having international guidelines for fair business practice and environmental sustainability and effective oversight of those practices? And what would it take to get there?
Well, I think to get there is going to take a really strong consumer movement, and the kind of pressure we've been building in the last couple of years has to keep going. And you know, sometimes it's hard because the media gets tired of the story. And so we have to sort of keep them involved, keep them pressuring. I think we're still a long way off. I think it'll take another decade of intense struggle to get to that point, and that if we let up, we'll never get it. So that's why I encourage all of you to join with us. Call Nike, tell them to let us into the factories, tell us to get the critics working with you, get independent monitoring going, pay a living wage, and then we promise Nike we'll start working on the national and the international level, so they won't be hanging out there by their own doing the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Medea. It'll be interesting to see what happens as time goes on, particularly with the international and global setting, to see whether there is a real